In the United States in the 1930s, all death row inmates were electrocuted. The guards would first shave a piece of hair off the top of the prisoner's head. A soaked sponge was placed over the head, then a leather hood was attached to the wire. The seconds leading up to death are very difficult. The prisoner's body trembles with fear. When the time comes, a powerful electric current runs through the prisoner's nervous system. The reason why the sponge is soaked. The sponge is soaked to minimize the prisoner's pain. A doctor must confirm the end of the electrocution. Only when the prisoner is completely cut off can everything be considered over. But on this day, a new guard came to the prison. He purposely didn't soak the sponge during the execution. The whole process was a torture for the prisoner. It wasn't long before the body exploded in sparks. The air was filled with the smell of burning. There's an unwritten prison rule. A prisoner can't stop until he's dead. Everyone can only watch as he is tortured to death. As white smoke filled the air, the scene was chaotic. Everyone scrambled to leave the scene. On the other side of the prison, a black prisoner was crying. Because the pain of the prisoner, John felt what he was going through. And the only reason he was in this prison, because of a good deed he did a while back. That day a farmer's 2 daughters suddenly disappeared. The whole village went out to look for them. They found them by a fallen tree trunk. They found the girls and a tall black man. John held the girls in his arms and wept in agony. 2 lives were lost in his arms, and there was nothing he could do. Everyone thought he was the killer. No one believed that John was trying to save the children, and no one would realize that they weren't catching a demon. It was an angel sent by God to save the world. Soon John was sentenced to prison for rape and murder. He was executed a month later, and Paul, who was in charge of the prison at the time, was sweating profusely in the toilet with a UTI. It took all his strength to squeeze out 2 drops. The guards told him the prisoner had arrived. He had to endure the pain and come out to work. He was confronted by a big man who came out of nowhere. Everyone was afraid. Paul was also surprised. In contrast to his tough exterior, John had a surprisingly soft heart. Not only was he careful with his words, he said he was afraid of the dark. He wanted to sleep with the lights on at night. His childlike pleas made the guards laugh. Kindly Paul told him that the light in the corridor would always be on. John was relieved, perhaps as a token of his appreciation. He extends his right hand to shake Paul's. It's a gesture that makes the temperature tense. Everyone tells Paul not to do anything stupid. If anything goes wrong, the consequences could be disastrous. But in the end, Paul believed John, and because of this handshake, John knew everything about Paul, and it would change Paul's life. Before leaving, John kept telling Paul, "I just wanted to be with them, but there was no time." These words had a deep meaning for Paul. He couldn't believe that the easygoing John would commit a crime. And yet, what was in the file wasn't far from the truth. The dark side of human nature was unbelievable to Paul. That day, there was an unexpected visitor to the prison. A little mouse came out of the cell. Apart from the prisoners and the guards, he was the only living thing here. Everyone loved the little guy. It always appeared out of nowhere, asked the guards for some cookies, then it disappears through the door of the cell block. Paul and the others teamed up to empty the cells. Strangely enough, the mouse was nowhere to be found. But the next day, the mouse appeared out of nowhere. The guards kindly offered him cookies, but Paige was screaming and yelling. He pulled out his truncheon and tried to smash the mouse to death. The mouse was scared and ran back to his cell, but Paige wasn't going to let it go. He took out his key and tried to open the door, and he kept yelling. The guards who went to get food heard the noise. He thought it was a riot. He left his lunchbox and rushed over, seeing Paige yelling and screaming. He made a mess of the prison. Paul couldn't help but speak up. He warned him that what he was doing was scaring everyone. For humanitarian reasons, the guards will do their best to accommodate the inmates before they are sentenced, and provide them with a quiet environment, so that they can go on their final journey in peace, except for Paige, the asshole, always causing trouble. But Paige thinks he can do whatever he wants here. Deputy Warden Brown couldn't stand it anymore. Tried to kick the shit out of the guy, but if he did, he'd lose his job, and Paul's going to stop him. He knows Paige has a lot of power behind him. It's not worth it for a little man. Paige was a public enemy in this prison. Paul, on the other hand, was careful to keep the relationship between them, trying to keep the day of reckoning as late as possible. Soon it was time for the prisoner's execution. He sat in the electric chair in full view of the crowd. Paul tried to calm him down. The man rubbed the top of his head. At this moment, he may have truly realized his mistake. He asked Paul if a man could go to heaven if he truly repented. Paul answered in the affirmative. After the electrocution, Paige sneered at the body of the condemned man. Brown pushed him away. Either way, the prisoner had paid for his mistake with his life. Paige didn't think so and thought Brown was wrong. Tom knew it was only a matter of time before there was more trouble. He also knew that Paige was just here for the transition. He prayed he'd leave sooner rather than later, but Paige had to do the electrocution herself, or he'd be here for everyone. Paul couldn't believe how irrational this guy was. He ignored Paige's outrageous demands. The next day, something unbelievable happened at the prison. The little mouse was tamed by an inmate named Dale. Under Dale's direction, Dale's command, The mouse could not only run up and down his arm, he could even roll a wooden axle. Dale named him Little Ginger. John thought it was a circus mouse. The reappearance of the little guy brought a little joy to the depressing prison and added some color to Dale's final days. But Paige couldn't stand to see anyone else happy. He came out and heaped scorn on them. Dale warned him not to hurt the little guy. There were too many people to do anything. Paige had to turn around and leave. Soon there was a new prisoner in the jail. The report said he was a vicious asshole, killed 3 people in a row in a robbery. But when the guards arrived, they found him in a mental institution. He was drooling in his eyes. Even the guards had to help him change into his uniform. Everyone thought he was crazy, and John kept reminding Paul to be careful with this new guy. And sure enough, when the cell door opened, the murderer came to his senses. He attacked when no one was looking. One of the guards was in a chokehold. Paul came to his aid. In the confusion, he was kicked in the crotch. Paul couldn't stand up because of the pain. Seeing that his colleagues were also knocked out, he got up from the pain, threatened the murderer with a gun, and urged Paige to do it. But Paige was too scared to move. Luckily, Brown arrived in time. That was the end of the drama. After everyone left, Paul couldn't stand it any longer and fell to the ground. And then John kept calling out to him. He said he had something very important to tell him. In order to take care of the prisoner's emotions, Paul stumbled over to him. John suddenly grabbed him and moved his hand downward. Paul was unable to resist. Dale, who was across the street, thought John was going to kill him. He called out for the guards. What happened next left him speechless. It was like a miracle. The nearest light in the cell became brighter and brighter. Paul felt like something was being sucked out of him. John didn't let go until the bulb burst. Then he sat down on the bed, exhausted. A swarm of filthy flying insects came out of his mouth. John didn't say anything. He just said he'd cured Paul. Then he fell back to sleep. Paul went into the bathroom again. He hadn't felt so good in all his years. And that night, his wife was very pleased. After years of searching for a cure, John had done it. The more he realized that John had been wronged. So the next day Paul took a sick day. He went to the home of the lawyer who had defended John. He wanted to know more about the case, but the lawyer didn't say a word about the case. Instead, he told Paul a story. His family had a dog. The dog was very cute and the whole family loved it. They lived together for a long time. But one day, he had a fit of the guts. He took one of his son's eyes. If it had been a little later, it could have killed someone. Maybe John had never killed anyone before, but his dog had never bitten anyone before. Before he left, the lawyer reminded Paul that human nature can never be understood. To thank John for curing him, Paul brought 2 pieces of his wife's cake, a rare treat in prison. John couldn't get enough of it. John had a craving, but he gave some to Dale and Little Ginger. The murderer, seeing that he hadn't been given any, started talking smack. Paul went up to him and told him to behave. He got spit in the face. Paul was never one to argue with a condemned man, but then the killer's behavior got worse. When the other guard turned his head, he pissed on his shoe. Then the rumor mill started up again. Paul and the others saw this. They decided to teach him a lesson. They took out the clutter from the cell block. The murderer didn't realize the seriousness of the problem. His mouth was still full of obscenities, provoking the guards. After a short while of arrogance, the guards taught him a lesson. They finally put him in solitary confinement. The next day, the guards found Dale. They said they wanted to see him and Little Jingles perform. It was like Dale had found his purpose again. He hurriedly changed into civilian clothes. In fact, Paul had planned the whole thing. The so-called leaders were all other guards pretending to be leaders. Because Dale's execution was coming up, Paige hadn't been in trouble lately. Paul was going to arrange for him to carry out the execution, just so he could get his wish and get out of here. When Dale returned to his cell after the show, he was confronted by the dreaded Paige. Dale was eyeballing him. Paige was all talk. Suddenly, he yelled. Dale fell to the floor. Brown rushed him into the cell, but Paige was still following him around. But the murderer grabbed him by the hand. He was terrified by the obscenities in his ear. Paul immediately pulled out his gun to stop him, and the murderer let go of his hand. Dale was so happy to see this, because Paige was pissing her pants. Now he was a clown in front of everyone. Paige cried and swore to God that if anyone told anyone about this day, they'd be out of a job. And he warned Dale that sooner or later, he'd make him pay. As the day of execution drew near, Paul talked to Dale. He knew that the mouse was the last thing on his mind, so he suggested that in the future, he could send him to the circus. Adults would be charged 10 cents a show, and children would be charged only 2 cents. Dale was very happy to hear that. Maybe that's where the little mouse could realize his worth. Just then, the roller accidentally bounced outside, and the little mouse went after it. And then the dastardly Paige reappeared. He stomped on the mouse and turned it into a pancake. Dale was devastated. It was the only thing that kept him going. While everyone was silent, John asked Paul to give the mouse to him. After a moment's hesitation, he took the mouse in his hand and walked slowly toward John. No one could understand what John was doing. Only Dale kept pleading with him to save the mouse. And then the miracle happened again. The mouse showed signs of life, and then John vomited a lot of dirt out of his mouth. The crowd watched the scene unfold. No one could explain why miracles happen so often in this prison. Soon Paul and Brown found Paige. They pinned him to the wall and warned him that if he didn't leave voluntarily, everyone would tell the truth about the pants wedding. And then, even if there was someone at the top, It wouldn't matter. Page was clearly scared. He promised to leave as soon as the execution was over. Unfortunately, this time it was Dale. He finally touched the mouse and gave it to John for safekeeping. Paul promised to send the mouse to the circus at some point. Dale was relieved because the floor leading to the execution chamber is covered in green paint. That's why they call it the Green Tour. It rained heavily that night. The victim's family was impatient, and to make matters worse, when Dale walked through the door to find that his executioner was actually Page. With the electrocution about to begin, everything was ready to go. Before putting on the hood, Dale told John to take the little mouse to the circus, but even at the last minute, Page wouldn't let Dale go. He told the lie right in front of everyone. Dale was devastated. What's worse, Page knew that the sponge had to be dipped in water before the execution, but he didn't. No one noticed, except for Paul, who thought it was strange. Why wasn't there any water on the floor? He had a bad feeling about it, and sure enough, when the switch was flipped, the dry sponge didn't let the electricity run through his body. Dale screamed as he was burned. There was a burning smell in the air. Paul tried to stop it, but once the electrocution starts, it can't be stopped. Meanwhile, in the cell, the murderer was in a state of euphoria, and John was convulsing. It was as if he felt Dale's pain. The little mouse was so frightened, he fled the prison. As the situation became more and more gruesome, it became clear that this was an inferno. A charred Dale was spitting flames. Even the families of the victims couldn't stand it. People are trying to escape. Paige turned her back and couldn't look away. Paul went right up to him and held him down, let him know what he'd done, and so Dale paid for all his sins. He died with a heavy burden of malice. Afterwards, Paige said she didn't know anything about it. Brown couldn't stand it any longer. He punched Paige in the face. It was an emotional moment. When Paul returned to his cell, he found John in tears. He could feel Dale's pain. That's why he's always crying. Unfortunately, pain will always be a constant companion. A few days later, Paul went to visit the warden. The two had been close friends for a long time, but the warden's wife now had a brain tumor. She couldn't speak very well. Paul couldn't bear to see his friend suffer like this, so he had a bold idea. He invited his colleagues to his home for dinner. He told them what he wanted to do. When they talked about John, they all knew what he was doing. Everyone was on board with his plan. They all wanted to see another miracle. That night, the men used sleeping pills to knock out the murderer. Then they put Paige in the brig. It was as if John knew the plan ahead of time. He was up and ready to go. They were about to head out when the unexpected happened. The murderer, who was supposed to be unconscious, woke up. He grabbed John, and John couldn't stop twitching. The man standing in front of him was an evil man. He couldn't stay in this world. The next moment, the lights were shattered. As everyone was at a loss as to what to do, the murderer suddenly fainted outside the prison. John pointed out the stars in the sky and was very happy. He shared with Paul the constellations he saw. On the way, he picked up a handful of leaves and smelled them. Then he happily shared it with the three guards. It was at this moment that Brown realized he hadn't brought his gun with him. When he heard something outside the house, the warden looked around with his gun. As the men talked, John knew what was going on. He got out of the car and went to the warden. He puts his hands on the barrel of the gun, tells the warden he's just here to help. And that's how John got to the warden's bedroom. And when he saw this big, black man in front of him, the irascible madam became very quiet. John slowly leaned down, and then the miracle happened again. An incredible glow began to appear. The lights around us grew brighter and brighter, and the clock stopped ticking. And when it was over, the lady was back to her old self. But this time, John didn't spit out the filth. As a token of appreciation, Madam gave John a necklace. It was as if they'd seen each other in the dark, but there was no time for old times talk. They're going to take John back to the prison immediately. Otherwise, the consequences of discovery would have been disastrous. Luckily, everything went smoothly. Paul released Paige, tied up, and John was waiting. He grabbed Paige by the neck. No one could stop him. John poured all the filth in his body into Paige's mouth, and then he fell to the ground. Paige became delirious. He went to the murderer's cell. He executed the demon with his own gun. The crowd was stunned by the suddenness of the scene. As they subdued Paige, the filth inside him also drilled out. John said he had punished these two evil men. Then he took Paul's hand and gave Paul his powers. And then the light bulbs in the room started popping one by one, and Paul saw it all. It was an incredibly happy family of four. They should have been happy forever, but the devil was hiding in their midst. The murderer was a sick man, killed two little girls alive. Paul fought as hard as he could to get away. He couldn't bear the malice and the pain, but John suffered at every moment of every day. But even if he knew the truth, Paul couldn't change it. Soon it would be John's day of execution, but he wasn't guilty, and the real killer was gone. Paul couldn't bear the thought of an angel being wrongly accused, so he planned to let John go quietly. He would take all the blame himself, but John only hoped that the day of execution would come soon, because he'd had enough of the world's deceitfulness. He just wanted to leave without pain. Before he left this world, John's greatest wish was to see a film. Paul got his wish. The people in the film danced and didn't worry. It was like being in heaven. During the execution, John asked not to wear the hood. He was afraid of the darkness that lies in everyone's heart. The guards cried. No one wanted to see an angel fall before their eyes. It was their last execution. After that, They all went to the correctional center to rescue young people who had lost their way for a while. The day before Paul left, the little mouse suddenly reappeared. Years went by after that. All we know is that there was a strange old man in the nursing home. He was very old, but he was very healthy. Every morning, with just 2 pieces of dry food, he would walk along the green grass. No one knew what he did, until the old man accidentally saw the film again. John told his story, and out of the cardboard box came the little mouse. It still rolls wooden axles today. Over the years, Paul had seen his friends and family die one by one. It was God's way of punishing him. He was punished for not killing the angel, and he was atoning for the sins of the world. The Miracle on the Green Mile was released in 1999. The film is not just a death row story. It's an exploration of human nature. It made me realize you can still find hope in despair. You can still see light in the darkness, but reality is often more cruel than the film. Well, that's the end of today's story. I look forward to our meeting again.